In the remote mountains of the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan, a routine military mission took an unexpected and disturbing turn. A reconnaissance team encountered strange phenomena, sudden temperature changes, equipment failures, and non-human traces. What seemed like a common operation became an encounter with something that defies conventional explanations. In this video, we'll analyze real accounts from soldiers who encountered an unusual presence in an isolated cave, where weapons were arranged as offerings and a mysterious figure appeared to warn them not to return. Discover the little-known story that blends war, Persian folklore, and phenomena that still puzzle experts. In November 2004, a U.S. Armed Forces reconnaissance team was sent on a routine mission near Bagram, Afghanistan. Their job was simple: investigate a possible insurgent weapons cache in a mountainous area known for sporadic clashes and weapon hideouts. Drones and local informants had gathered the intelligence, warning of suspicious activity in an old cave system. For the soldiers, it was just another day in the field, following standard entry and sweep procedures. But what seemed ordinary would soon reveal something far beyond military logic. The mission's nature would change drastically even before they stepped inside the cave entrance. The supposed hideout location was peculiar. Even the locals avoided it. The team had an Afghan interpreter, an older, respected man from the region, who hesitated when he saw where they were going. He told generational stories about a sacred, cursed place known for mysterious disappearances and for being guarded by an ancient entity. His warnings weren't immediately taken seriously. To the soldiers, it was just another local superstition, like so many others heard during missions in the country's interior. But the interpreter insisted that cave wasn't just dangerous, it was sacred, forbidden, and those who entered didn't come back the same. As they climbed the rocky trails to the main cave entrance, a discomfort began to grow among the soldiers. Even the most experienced, used to intense combat, noticed an unnatural silence hanging over the landscape. Not even the common sounds of nature, birds, insects, wind, were present. It was as if the very environment had been silenced by something invisible. The sky, clear moments before, filled with dense clouds in a matter of minutes, casting a shadow over the cave entrance. For one soldier, the air became so thick it was hard to breathe. Another mentioned an inexplicable unease, as if they were being watched closely. Upon reaching the cave entrance, the interpreter refused to go further. He stayed outside, praying silently with a rosary clutched in his hands, visibly shaken. One of the soldiers tried to persuade him to join the group, but he only replied that he had already gone too far and wouldn't interfere with the domains of ancient forces. Even among the military personnel, the atmosphere was strange. Communication equipment started glitching and radios crackled with static, even without apparent electromagnetic interference. It was as if something in that place resisted their presence, repelling their attempts to control the situation. Determined to complete the mission, the soldiers turned on their flashlights and entered the cave system, which seemed to stretch further than anyone expected. The natural structure didn't follow a common pattern. There were unusual rock formations, and the tunnels seemed almost carved, not just shaped by time. One of the soldiers with geology experience commented that the walls seemed to contain inscriptions faded by time, as if ancient civilizations had left their marks there. But what caught their attention most was the sudden increase in humidity and the drastic temperature change. From dry heat to a cutting cold, inexplicable considering the underground environment. Even with their training and proper equipment, the soldiers started reporting unusual physical and psychological discomforts. One felt sudden dizziness, another claimed to hear whispers in the distance, though no sound was recorded by their microphones. The normally focused sniffer dogs were restless, refusing to move forward at certain points in the cave. The tension was palpable, as if the space itself reacted to their presence. Still, the team pressed on, driven by the obligation to complete the mission and perhaps by a curiosity that grew as the normal signs of reality seemed to dissolve within those rocks. Nothing up to that point could have prepared the team for what was still to come. What began as a search for weapons in a remote hideout was rapidly transforming into something inexplicable, transcending the boundaries of the physical world and entering the realms of folklore, fear, and the supernatural. The presence of something unknown seemed increasingly evident, even if no direct contact had occurred yet. Their first step inside the cave had also been their first step toward the inexplicable. An involuntary plunge into a territory where the rules of modern warfare seemed to have no validity. As the team moved deeper into the cave system, environmental conditions became increasingly unusual. The cold they felt at the entrance grew even more intense, even tens of meters underground, where temperatures usually stabilize. One of the soldiers, Corporal Reynolds, quietly remarked that it felt like winter stored inside the rock. Sergeant Wallace, the team leader, tried to keep everyone focused on the mission, but the data on their digital thermometers didn't help. Sharp drops of up to 15 degrees Celsius in minutes. To top it off, a dense fog began to form in certain sections, despite the complete absence of visible water sources. It was as if the cave itself breathed cold, exhaling an eerie vapor from its depths. But the cold wasn't the only thing unsettling the team. A strong smell like burnt sulfur began to permeate the air. Initially, they thought it might be some form of natural gas leaking from underground fissures, a possible phenomenon in certain Afghan regions. However, chemical sensors registered nothing dangerous in the air, which only made the situation more confusing. The odor felt alive, according to the weapons specialist, McNeil. He swore the smell intensified whenever they approached certain forks or wider chambers. It was as if they were being pushed in the right direction or steered away from the wrong place by an invisible force communicating through the very air they breathed. Their flashlights, which had worked perfectly at the entrance, began to flicker in sync, even though they were different models with newly installed batteries. There was no immediate technical explanation, and attempts to swap batteries or replace equipment only worsened the problem. The darkness inside the cave seemed to devour the light, rendering even the most powerful tactical flashlight beams useless. Shadows projected on the walls took on strange, distorted shapes that seemed to move independently of the light source. Soldier Martinez even swore he saw the shadow of something moving in front of him, though no one else was there. The feeling of being watched became constant and silent, like a hum at the back of each member's mind. At certain points, the team's radios emitted static that intensified in specific locations, almost as if they were intercepting a ghost frequency. Amid the crackling, one or two words emerged clearly, spoken in a deep, drawn-out voice. One of them recognized the word Qatar, which means danger in Dari. The interpreter, who was still outside, received one of these transmissions and, upon hearing it, simply turned off his radio. Later, he refused to comment on it, only saying that some things shouldn't be heard with human ears. From that moment on, communication with the outside world became increasingly difficult, with transmissions coming and going in fragments, and navigating the darkened corridors grew more agonizing with each step. Despite all their training for hostile environments, the soldiers began to show unusual physical symptoms. Some reported a strange metallic taste in their mouths, as if they had bitten an oxidized iron blade. Others felt sudden nausea, loss of balance, and even a slight euphoria, followed by apathy. The unit's medic, Lieutenant Cooper, suspected environmental poisoning, but toxin tests revealed nothing abnormal. He recorded the symptoms in his notepad and told Wallace that it seemed like a neurological response to intense magnetic fields, a theoretical but unlikely possibility there. The hypothesis raised another question. What kind of force could produce such a widespread underground field? Most disturbing was that the anomalies seemed to follow almost intelligent patterns. The lights failed at the same points. The smell of sulfur always appeared before a specific fork. The voices on the radios came only when the team threatened to go down certain corridors. It was as if something, or someone, knew the cave's structure better than they did, and was trying to guide them, or test them. Even the soldiers' own behavior began to change. The silence between them grew heavier. Nervous jokes disappeared, replaced by grim looks and shallow breaths. The collective survival instinct had been replaced by something more primitive, pure irrational fear buried beneath the mask of military discipline. By the third hour inside the cave, the team reached a large central gallery with a natural dome ceiling. The flashlights briefly worked again, and they could see a series of marks on the walls, ancient symbols, precisely etched but partially covered by fungi and sediment. Lieutenant Cooper recognized some features resembling Buddhist inscriptions, while the local culture specialist, Corporal Davis, found similarities to pre-Islamic patterns used by nomadic tribes in the region. This indicated that the cave had been used or visited by civilizations long gone. But what caught their attention most was a circle on the floor, formed by black stones that appeared slightly polished. Inside this circle, the smell of sulfur was almost unbearable, and the cold seemed to cut to the bone. It was at this point that the electronic equipment simply stopped working. Without warning, motion sensors, thermal cameras, and flashlights ceased responding. Batteries fully drained in seconds, as if an invisible force had sucked all their energy. The only device that continued to function, albeit with interference, was an analog recorder carried by chance by Sergeant Wallace, normally used for field observations. When they played the tape later, they heard inexplicable sounds, rhythmic thumps, as if something large was walking on stone, a deep voice murmuring words in an unknown language, and finally, a human scream captured in the background, which none of the soldiers recognized as coming from their team. From then on, the logic of the space began to fail. Corridors that led to one point before now led to another. Maps quickly drawn with chalk didn't match the way back. The GPS, obviously useless inside, was replaced by visual markings, which also mysteriously disappeared. It was as if the cave itself rearranged to confuse the intruders. Some began to doubt their own perception of time. Lieutenant Cooper's watch showed 5 p.m., while Corporal Martinez's indicated 3 a.m. Without access to the sky or reference points, the team no longer knew how long they had been there. They only knew that something, beyond the physical, was interfering with their minds and instruments. In this growing chaos, the only constant was the feeling that something was watching them. The most sensitive swore they felt a solid presence behind them, large, unmoving, watchful. Even if they saw nothing, even if they heard no footsteps, it was as if the air around them gained weight and form, pressing on their shoulders and necks. One of the most repeated phrases in later accounts was, "We weren't alone." And indeed, everything pointed to that. The cave wasn't just a weapons hideout as they thought. It was a liminal territory, a border between the physical world and something ancient. A place where the air burned with cold, where senses failed, and where reality itself seemed to bend before forces that didn't let themselves be seen, but made sure to be felt. As the team moved even deeper into the cave, they began to notice traces, indicating that the place had been used over centuries, perhaps millennia. The walls, besides being covered with faded inscriptions, showed signs of artificial erosion, as if ancient tools had shaped certain corridors. One soldier found what appeared to be a partially collapsed staircase carved directly into the rock, leading to an upper platform. At the top, there were circular marks on the floor, possibly remnants of some kind of altar or ritual area. Even worn by time, the grooves seemed precisely planned. This was no simple natural cave. It was a place with a purpose, perhaps religious. A few meters further, the team came across a partially collapsed side chamber, where the floor still retained recent marks, footprints. At first, they thought they might be from their own soldiers who had gone ahead, but the size of the tracks soon contradicted that hypothesis. They were wide, deep footprints, with proportions incompatible with any known military boot. They had long, wide toes, as if left by something humanoid but enormous. Furthermore, they didn't follow a logical pattern. They didn't go in a straight line or double back. Some seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish into the wall, as if the creature had emerged from within the rock itself. While investigating the footprints, they also found remnants of human objects, an old Soviet flashlight still bearing the red star symbol. Beside it, a combat knife from the same period, stuck in the wall as if thrown with supernatural force. These were traces of soldiers who had likely explored the area during the Soviet occupation between 1979 and 1989, but no known reports mentioned cave missions at those coordinates. Were they deserters, lost units, or had they been drawn, decades earlier, by the same silent call that now guided the Americans into the darkness? The presence of these ancient artifacts seemed to confirm that this wasn't just an insurgent hideout, but a convergence point between eras. Beyond the Soviet equipment, the team found even older evidence. Wooden stakes with partially burned Sanskrit inscriptions were stuck in one of the inner chambers. They looked like remnants of some lost ritual where fire, symbols, and possibly sacrifices were part of the process. One soldier pointed out that the stake's position coincided with the cardinal directions, and in the center was a stone slab with dark stains, hard to identify at first glance. Corporal Davis suggested that this space had been used for invocations or sealings. The connection between primitive Buddhism, pre-Islamic cults, and the occult symbolism present there was too frightening to be a coincidence. It was in this same gallery that the equipment began to fail again. The cameras that still worked picked up static, and one of them briefly registered for milliseconds what appeared to be a tall, hooded figure in the darkest corner of the room. When the team looked at the spot, there was nothing there, but the heat sensor indicated a presence with an abnormal temperature, too cold to be human, but distinct from the surrounding environment. The place also had a strange echo, voices distorted, returning with a delay or in lower tones. Some soldiers reported hearing their own words repeated with subtle alterations, as if someone, or something, was imitating them. Lieutenant Cooper, analyzing the marks on the floor, commented that they resembled an archaic type of ritualistic writing used to protect places considered portals or mouths of the spiritual world. This aligned with what the interpreter had mentioned outside about the place being known for legends of gates to the realm of the Div, supernatural entities from Persian mythology. Ancient records describe the Div as creatures that guarded sacred places and punished those who profaned them. The pattern of the symbols reinforced the idea that this wasn't just a shelter, but a threshold zone between worlds. The mystery gained a new layer of meaning. They weren't just in enemy territory, they were on forbidden ground. Further on, they found a kind of mural carved directly into the rock. The scene showed human figures kneeling before a gigantic entity with horns and flaming eyes. The style was rudimentary, but conveyed a clear sense of reverence and fear. The entity seemed to float above the people, and lines extended from its eyes to the skulls of the represented humans, as if sucking something from them. Perhaps it was a spiritual metaphor, but the context made everything sound too literal. It was impossible to ignore the parallel between the creature in the mural and the Div accounts, as well as the presence of footprints and inexplicable phenomena that had been accumulating. Even the most skeptical soldiers began to doubt what was real. The anomalies no longer seemed to be the result of individual hallucinations, but rather an environment that reacted to them, as if testing their limits. The constant presence of that metallic taste in their mouths, coupled with the smell of sulfur and the heavy silence, created a total psychological oppression. No one spoke loudly, and everyone avoided looking directly into the dark corridors, fearing to see what they couldn't explain. Each discovery, instead of answering questions, brought new layers of unease. The objects, the marks, the symbols, everything seemed to suggest continuous activity, as if that cave had never truly been abandoned. Sergeant Wallace, even while trying to maintain discipline, later admitted in his diary that at that point he was no longer commanding a reconnaissance team, but rather a group of men trapped in a space they didn't understand. The initial objective, to find weapons or insurgent routes, had dissolved in the face of the evidence before them. They were inside something larger, older, and possibly hostile, and the feeling that they were being led to a specific point didn't cease. There was an invisible, traced path that took them deeper and deeper, as if the cave itself, or what inhabited it, was waiting for them to reach the heart of its domain. The final descent led the group to a central chamber larger than any they had crossed. The stone walls seemed to pulsate faintly under the intermittent flashlight beams, and the floor had a damp sheen, as if exhaling sweat. The smell of sulfur reached almost unbearable levels, making the soldiers cover their faces with wet cloths. A supernatural silence filled the air. There was no echo, no sound of footsteps, only the tense breathing of the men. Suddenly, a cold wind blew from one of the side corridors, even without an identifiable draft. It was at this moment that the lights completely went out, and a collective chill ran through the group. Something, or someone, was in there with them. From the middle of the darkness, a figure began to form. First, eyes glowing like incandescent coals, then the outline of an enormous body, taller than any known human. The creature seemed to have darkened, almost rocky skin, with fissures from which a reddish glow emanated. It had curved horns pointing backward, long muscular arms, and hands that ended in elongated, sharp fingers. The air around it vibrated as if an invisible electrical discharge was present. But the most striking thing was when it spoke. In perfect English, with a deep, echoing voice, it commanded,
"Leave. You do not belong here."
The soldiers, caught between panic and military conditioning, didn't react with violence. Sergeant Wallace stepped forward, asking who or what the creature was. The answer was simple, yet enigmatic.
"Guardian of the sacred. I was invoked. I was forgotten. But I am still here."
The entity's presence was overwhelming. The now useless flashlights flickered briefly again, revealing that the figure seemed to merge with the cave itself, as if it were part of the rock. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly. It was as if its presence had activated something ancient, buried in the stones for centuries, perhaps millennia. None of the soldiers dared to raise their weapons. It wasn't fear of being attacked, but a silent certainty that any act of aggression would be futile or fatal. The creature took another step forward and, with a simple movement, made the temperature plummet. Ice crystals began to form on the edges of the walls. One of the soldiers tried to move, but his body momentarily paralyzed, as if the surrounding environment was too dense to allow movement. The creature then pointed to the circular symbols on the ground and said,
"This ground is sealed. To break the seal is to bring oblivion."
No one immediately understood, but the tension in the air made it clear. They had transgressed something sacred. The atmosphere grew more oppressive. The cave itself seemed to shrink, pressing the men against the walls. The creature raised its arms, and a deep sound echoed throughout the structure, like the rolling of gigantic stones. It wasn't a scream or a roar, it was a command. The inscriptions on the ceilings began to glow more intensely, and the soldiers' radios briefly came back to life, transmitting static screams in unknown languages. Lieutenant Cooper, with trembling hands, fell to his knees, repeating disconnected phrases. The creature approached him, looked deeply into his eyes, and said,
"You heard. They heard too."
Cooper would lose part of his speech in the following days, diagnosed with acute psychological trauma. Curiously, the creature showed no direct hostility. Its intention seemed clear: to protect, to warn, to deter. but the force with which it did so was incompatible with any human concept of safety. It was like an ancient god punishing children who played with sacred fire. Its presence made time seem to slow down. The metallic taste in the soldiers' mouths increased, their hands tingled, and some began to sweat coldly despite the freezing temperature. One soldier fainted, and another began to laugh uncontrollably, as if he were having a nervous breakdown. The entire cave seemed to resonate with the entity's vibration, as if it were the living heart of the space itself. At one point, the creature stopped. It stood motionless for long seconds, as if listening to something distant. Then it looked directly at Wallace and said,
"You have been warned. Go back. There is no salvation for those who disturb oblivion."
These words echoed in everyone's minds, as if they had been spoken directly inside their heads. Without further explanation, the entity slowly retreated, disappearing amidst the shadows and the mist that began to rise from the floor. The flashlights came back on, but the atmosphere was different, colder, damper, and with an even deeper silence. It was as if something had been awakened, and now it was just waiting. The team didn't discuss what had happened. They simply began to exit the cave one by one, carrying their unconscious comrade and assisting Lieutenant Cooper, who was still disoriented. The interpreter, seeing the soldiers' faces emerge, immediately paled. He asked nothing. He simply made the sign of the cross and walked away without a word. The retreat was slow, almost ritualistic, as if each step back was a permission granted. No one looked back. It was as if everyone instinctively knew that looking back into the darkness would be an invitation for it to follow them. The creature did not pursue them. It was not necessary. Its message had been clear. Later, outside the cave, as they tried to record what they saw, the accounts were inconsistent in details but identical in essence. Everyone described the same creature, the same voice, the same sensations. None of them had a rational explanation. The possibility of collective hallucination was dismissed, given the coherence of the testimonies and the absence of drugs or toxins. It didn't fit any known pattern. What they confronted wasn't just a phenomenon. It was an entity with consciousness, language, purpose, and power. A forgotten guardian who now once again awoke, not by will, but by necessity. What that creature truly was remains an open question. A spiritual being? A remnant of an earlier civilization? A collective psychic manifestation? Or a leftover from something older than humanity itself? No study, no military or theological doctrine seemed capable of explaining it. But for those men, a silent truth had settled in. There are places that do not belong to us, and there are entities that still watch over these domains, waiting in the dark for us not to make the mistake of forgetting they exist. After the team's return and the case was filed, civilian specialists and academics, quietly invited to assess what happened, began to investigate possible parallels between the entity described by the soldiers and figures present in regional cultural traditions. The creature, according to reports, exhibited a series of characteristics that aligned it with the div of Persian mythology. Gigantic beings, often demonic, who inhabited remote regions and protected sacred territories. These creatures, in ancient stories, weren't necessarily evil, but rather guardians of a cosmic balance, tasked with keeping humans away from knowledge or forces that could corrupt them. In the Zoroastrian tradition, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, the div were associated with darkness and spiritual ignorance. But even within that narrative, there were ambiguous mentions of their nature. Some ancient texts describe corrupted divs. Others, however, suggest they were simply misunderstood, exiled from a higher plane to protect forbidden regions. The location where the mission occurred, between Bagram and ancient trade routes, was in ancient times a religious and spiritual crossroads. Archaeological records indicate that the region served both Buddhist cults and older shamanistic traditions. Some historians pointed out that caves always played a special role in Persian and Central Asian cosmologies. They were seen as passages, wombs of the earth, where contact with deities or non-human forces became possible. Language analysts noted that some words engraved there weren't in any modern dictionary, suggesting either forgotten linguistic variations or even symbolic language for spiritual purposes. This type of writing is often associated with esoteric orders and secret societies that maintain oral and written traditions restricted to initiated members, often passed down in underground environments. Curiously, Afghan folklore scholars pointed out that legends very similar to the report's descriptions already existed among the region's pastoral peoples. Stories about the guardian of the dark stones or the man with the cave voice circulated among older villagers, always accompanied by warnings that no one should enter certain caves where time stops. In some accounts collected by anthropologists in the 1970s, these guardians demanded silence and respect and punished those who dared to mock or desecrate the sanctuaries with disappearance. The pattern of undocumented disappearances of local shepherds, guides, and soldiers around Bagram dates back decades. Another point of connection came from Soviet occupation records. Despite censorship and the strong anti-religious policy of the USSR, some documents from deserting soldiers spoke of breathing caves and figures made of rock and fire in the Afghan mountains. A diary recovered in 1992 described an encounter similar to the American team's, a gigantic creature that spoke in archaic Russian, demanding the men withdraw from a sacred area. The diary was dismissed as war delusion by many, but now, in light of the new incident, it gains weight as possible evidence of recurrence, a cycle that transcends armies, ideologies, and eras. Theologians consulted suggested that in various cultures there are intermediate entities associated with the protection of ancient knowledge: angels, jinns, sentinels, watchers. The observed entity's behavior resembles these archetypal figures. It didn't attack, didn't pursue, only warned and set boundaries. This aligns with the idea that the location was more than a shelter. It was a seal, a point of containment between forgotten forces and the world of the living. In this sense, the encounter was not just a paranormal event, but a symbolic confirmation that certain regions of the planet still maintain links with realities that escape contemporary logic. The parallels with other cultures are also notable. In Japan, there are reports of mountain kami who protect sacred areas. In Scandinavia, Jotuns who guard ancestral territories. In Brazil, tribes speak of the encantados who live beneath the earth. In all these cases, there's a constant: beings who demand respect, silence, and isolation. The pattern observed in the Afghan cave follows this global tradition, as if these figures belong to the same ancestral archetype. This reinforces the idea that what the team found was not a hallucination, but an authentic contact with something rooted in humanity's collective unconscious and preserved by cultures that still respect the invisible. Most intriguing to scholars was the consistency of the soldiers' accounts with these traditions, even without them having any prior training in these areas. This, according to anthropologists and psychologists, strengthens the possibility that the event was real and not the result of a collective psychic construct. Fear, respect, and paralysis in the face of the other's presence are common in encounters with the sacred or what is perceived as the totally different. The language used by the entity, simple, direct in English, is also consistent with reports of beings manifesting using the most accessible communication possible for the humans present, avoiding noise or misinterpretation. Today, few scholars have access to the complete mission material, but among those who have seen the records, there's an uncomfortable consensus. The cave wasn't just a geographical point, it was a knot in the fabric of the world. A place where ancient memories, forgotten entities, and buried rituals still pulse, waiting for those who dare to remember. The entity seen by the American team may not have been a monster, but a warning. A reminder that there are places that don't belong to linear time, nor to human dominion. And that no matter how much we try to erase their traces, They always return, disguised as legend, camouflaged in stone.